is one of the closest friends you've ever had? I want you to just take a second and try to think of that person. Imagine them for a minute. It might be an old friend from childhood or from high school or from college. Maybe it's a roommate or a family member or a coworker or a gym buddy or a church friend. Are you thinking of someone? Now I want you to imagine that somebody else is interviewing you and this close friend of yours about your friendship. And they're asking you all kinds of questions. Questions like, what were the circumstances in which you first met each other? Was there a moment when you knew that you guys were just going to be good friends? What struggles or joys brought you guys close together? What are some of your favorite stories together? Why do you think you're such close friends? That's what Julie Beck, a writer at The Atlantic, did as part of a series she called The Friendship Files. It was a series of 100 friendship interviews over the course of about 3 years. She wanted to know what makes friendships work? How do they form? And what she found after doing about 100 interviews is that there are some consistent themes. And what I love is that what she found as she studied the formation of friendships is similar to what we find when we study the formation of community within the earliest churches. In this unit, we're talking about a habit of community, which is a network of friendships, particularly within the church, that each has differing levels of depth. And in a time where people are feeling increasingly isolated and they're just longing for deeper friendships, I think this habit is more needed than ever. And I think it's one of those things that's going to be particularly attractive to the onlooking world if we can get it right. Like the other habits, community is one of the habits we see in the life of the earliest churches that help them close the gap between the life you're living and the life you're made for. But you can think of the habit of community as a container habit, like a container that you can put lots of other things into. The habit of community is a habit that you can put other habits into. So for example, you can read the Bible on your own, or you can read it in community, which is you should be doing. You can pray on your own, or you can pray in community, and you should be doing both of those things. Or mission on your own, mission in community. All of these things can be done in community as well. And so that's why you see this habit all throughout Acts chapter 2, 41 through 47, because it's supporting all of the other habits. And so if you read this closely, Acts 2, 41 through 47, I believe that there is a 5-ingredient recipe for community that can help us form community in our own time. It's a tried and true, not so secret recipe that's supported by not only the Bible, but just research on how human relationships actually work. And so as we go through each of these ingredients, I want you to look for where they show up in the close friendships that I asked you about. And there's going to be more than this probably in the formation of your friendship, but every friendship has the same basic ingredients. Kind of like when you're making bread, you have to have water, yeast, flour, and salt. But then you might have some extra ingredients as well that add its own flavor. The formation of your friendships is going to be the same way. So let's talk about the basic ingredients that all friendships share. The first one is commonality. Commonality. Acts chapter 2, verse 41 says, so those who accepted his message were baptized. They held that in common. We're going to talk a bit more about that in just a second. But if you're going to find community, it starts by having something in common. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Four Loves. And at one point he described friendship in a whole chapter. And he said, there's this moment where friendship happened. And he calls it this moment. It's the moment where you say, what? You too? I thought I was the only one. It's the realization that you and this other person that you thought was a stranger has something in common with you and you just click. Maybe you both share the same interest in sci-fi, or board games, or sports, or food, or books. Maybe you have similar life experience or similar childhoods. Or maybe your kids go to the same school, or they're the same ages, or you have the same kind of dog. These are the what, you two, I thought I was the only one kind of moments. And every community and every story of friendship has them. And in the church, though, everybody who believes in Jesus has something in common that gets beneath or gets beyond the typical superficialities that bind us together. Superficialities like interest and age and ethnicity and status. Describing what happens in baptism, here's what Paul writes. He says, for we were all baptized by one Spirit into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and we were all given one Spirit to drink. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 13. Our former commonalities, what he's saying, don't matter as much as the fact that we all share the same lowest common denominator in Jesus. My dad, who's also a pastor, used to say when he was preaching, where else in the world would you find this group of people gathered? That's what Paul is talking about here. The second ingredient is vulnerability. It says that they were devoted to the fellowship. Acts chapter 2, verse 42. Vulnerability is about letting people see the real you. It's about taking your guard down that we keep up for most people for most of our lives. It means letting people see who you are. And that's risky because you're showing people where it's going to be easiest to wound you. The word for fellowship here is the Greek word koinonia, which means something like close mutual association, which is not necessarily the most fun phrase, but it's the best idea available for the level of closeness that gets below the surface and into the real stuff of your lives, the deep sharing of life. There's more going on in this than vulnerability, but that's an essential part of what koinonia is all about. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, describing how community forms in his book Life Together, written in the context of where he was forming a hidden community during the Third Reich, he calls this part of the recipe confession. He says this: in confession, the breakthrough to community takes place. Sin demands to have a man or a woman by himself or herself. It withdraws them from the community. He says that there can be no breakthrough without vulnerability. And so think about your deepest friendships for a moment. There's probably a moment where they went a little bit deeper because you revealed something about yourself. You let your guard down and you trusted them with information about you. You were vulnerable. So the third ingredient is reliability. Reliability. It says they sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. In short, what you see is that they were there for each other. And so when people decided to follow Jesus, it often meant losing their lives as they knew it. It meant losing jobs or friendships or support networks, everything that they knew, everything they had built over their lives. And suddenly they had to rely on other people to care for them. Robert Putnam, in his classic book on community called Bowling Alone, calls this social capital. And what social capital is the connections that arise between people as you show up again and again in their lives in times of need. And you build up more and more trust. And that's what we see happening in the early church. They had a lot of social capital in that community. Why? Because they were providing for each other. They were meeting each other's material needs. But it gets beyond that as well. They weren't just meeting each other's material needs. They also had to depend on each other through some pretty intense experiences. If you read the rest of Acts, one of the themes that you see is that they went through some persecution as they began to take the gospel to all nations. And that it was hard to be a follower of Jesus. And they had to depend on each other in those circumstances. Which is why Alan Hirsch, paraphrasing an anthropologist named Victor Turner, he calls this effect of depending on each other during challenging experiences, not just community, he calls it communitas. And here's how he describes it. He says, communitas, in his view, in Victor Turner's view, happens in situations where individuals are driven to find each other through a common experience of ordeal, humbling, transition, and marginalization. It often involves intense feelings of social togetherness and belonging brought about by having to rely on each other in order to survive. It's the same reason why if you go to battle with someone, you're going to be friends with that person for a long time. You went through something really hard together. The fourth ingredient is regularity. It says every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple. You might remember one of the 6 mistakes we talked about was the lack of intentionality. And that's just as true for the habit of building community as it is for every other habit. Community does not happen by accident one day a week. It says every day they were making time for each other. They were meeting together. And this doesn't mean necessarily that we have to make time to meet up every single day. Our friendship's not going to happen. But that community formation requires intentional regularity over a period of time. The more often you meet and the better quality those meetings are, the faster friendship will form. So for example, if you're only seeing somebody at church once a week and you're only able to have a 5-minute conversation at best before they're on their way to lunch, don't be surprised if it takes forever to form friendships with people, or if friendships never happen in the first place. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is a good friendship. In fact, Julie Beck discovered that it takes something like 40 to 60 hours on average over like a 6-week span to turn an acquaintance into a casual friend. Apparently there's research on this. And something like 80 to 100 hours for friendships to become more than that, which is why friendships tend to form easiest and most quickly in places where you're already spending time with other people, something like a college dorm or a workplace. But this is really challenging in our cultural moment where the advent of digital technology has pushed pushed us away from each other, as Sherry Turkle says, where we're suddenly alone together, and the increasing demands of work and parenting just seem to keep pushing us further and further away from each other. We just don't have time for one another in our schedules. And so that means that unless you're living in a college dorm or with roommates that you see all the time, you have to intentionally find ways to meet up with other people more often. Julie Beck says you have to find ways to bake it into your schedule, just to make it a part of your life. And one of the best ways to do that is to take things that you're already doing and then make friends a part of that as best as you can, like grocery shopping or something like that. How can you make friends a part of what you're already doing? The fifth ingredient is this, is festivity. It says, and they broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts. There is an atmosphere of festivity. And I love the word festivity because it comes from the same word as feast. There's something about eating together and having a good time that's connected to the formation of community. And it seems that friendship happens faster and easier around tables than anywhere else in the world. And that's why in this text, you don't just see them eating. You see them eating together and having a really good time, like a raucous good time together. They're having a festive time in this text. The phrase breaking bread here likely refers to both eating meals together and taking part in what's known as the Lord's Supper or communion together as well. Because in the early church, those two things often happened at the same time. You'd have a joyous meal together, and then as part of that, you'd remember what Jesus has done for us as communion. And originally, what they called it was the love feast. But I'm okay if we don't necessarily bring that phrase back. But what meals do is they make space, they create space for long, lingering conversations that continue long after you've stopped eating. Just think through some of the best conversations that you've ever had in your life. There's a good chance those happened while you were eating with somebody. They happened over meals or at drinks or at a party with no agenda. And there's plenty of research to back up the way that food acts as fuel for conversation and for friendship. That's the basic recipe for community. Commonalities, that what you two, I thought I was the only one moment. Plus vulnerability, some honesty thrown in there. Reliability, you got to go through some challenges together. Plus regularity, so lots of hours are involved. And then finally, plus festivity, lots of food and laughter. And together, that will equal community every single time. You've probably experienced that recipe in your friendships in the past. And if you're going to start a habit of community in the present, you might add some other stuff into that, but the core recipe is going to stay the same almost every time.